So it was always a nice easy start, especially after the weekend where perhaps you're being a bit lax or something like that, and start to turn in the center of your body. Feet are parallel, pointing forward as much as possible. And I always add that rider as much as possible. I spent years straightening up my feet. My feet, just like a lot of people, my feet do turn out, which means that standing with the feet parallel was always difficult. I spent years with teachers correcting me, and gradually change is coming about. I think the straighter the better, because I think that helps to keep your back open. But then one day came across a line in a piece of writing by Grandmaster Chen Xiaowang. Master Chen is standard bearer for Chen family Tai Chi. He's a very senior, highly respected teacher. And he just happened to mention, he was talking about this stance, a stance which he described as one of the most difficult stances to get in the entire system, which is interesting in itself. And he said you should stand with your feet parallel, comma, or slightly turned out. So slightly turned out is that, it's not right out there. And that can often open up your hip a little bit and allow you to sink down. So if it's too far out, then it starts to, if you like, disperse the focus of our movement, the direction of our movement. But a slight turnout like this doesn't really do that. So it enables you to basically face forward when you're still, but does allow that little bit of extra space in your hip. Mostly I can stand like this with my feet parallel these days, but if I'm not paying attention, I do find that they kind of slip out. I've never quite caught them at it, but that can and does happen. But generally speaking, when you're still, shoulders, imagine a line across your shoulders, a line across your hips, a line across your toes. And if you're facing a wall or indeed a computer screen, then those lines are parallel to the lines that you're facing. And it's a way of orientating yourself in the space that we move in. If I come a little bit closer, the next thing you want to think about with this, and this really is a long-term prospect. All of these things, I think, should be seen as aspirations, but I don't want this to happen. My knees moving from side to side. In the long term, that's going to hurt your knees, but in the short term, it does compromise your structure. So the movement is here in your hips, maybe expanding a little bit up towards your shoulders, maybe not. But the important thing is to be aware of this movement here and here. And it's not really very much. You can't get much movement there. Our hip joints are very mobile joints. That's one of the most mobile in the body. But when there's two of them, they kind of work against each other. If I didn't have that foot there, I could turn right out there. But if I turn this way with 2 feet there, then I soon meet a restriction from the other side. So this area between hips and waist is sometimes interestingly described as like being like the hub of a wheel. And if you imagine something like a bicycle wheel, the hub has the spokes attached and they radiate out to the rim. A small movement in the hub, and so a small movement in that end of the spoke, will become a much larger movement when it reaches the rim of the wheel. And in the same way, we don't need to try to move our arms to here or here or here, subject to what we were just talking about, that there isn't something you're going to bang your hand into there. But if you've got the space, you just allow your arms to swing and they'll arrive in the right place. And there'll be considerably more movement in your fingertips than there are than you'll find in your hips. Can you imagine a little spotlight in the navel, just panning across the area in front of you, if that helps. And just generally getting a sense for how the movements will build up through waist to solar plexus to ribs to shoulders and finally down into your arms. So in this exercise, your shoulders are very loose and your arms feel quite heavy. Two characteristics that we want to try and retain as we go through the different movements, even though there's much more form to the arms in many of the movements. And that process of taking this movement that we've got, this energy that we feel in our arms and our hands, and the quality of movement that we feel in our arms and our hands, into a more structured shape, so one that's defined by the exercise that we're doing, without actually reintroducing a quality of tightening. And again, that's quite a tricky process. What's helpful is to realize that without you doing anything with your arms in this exercise, there's a great deal of energy there, there's a great deal of movement. So we don't really have to create the movement in our arms. It's being created for us. All we really have to do is to give the movement a shape. So two ideas that may help you sort of grasp that idea a little bit better. One is, it reminds me a bit of cycling. When you're on a bike, you pump the pedals up and down, and that moves you along. You don't use your arms to move you along by and large, use them a little bit, but not much. And then you move in your hips, your shoulders, and to an extent your arms and your hands to direct, to give a direction to the movement. And another idea, another image, which I think is a rather lovely one, and it was one that came from a delightful comment once when I was doing a taster session for some people in a local Girl Guides troop. They were lovely. They had a really nice evening with them and did some demonstration. One of the young women there, very shyly, put her hand up at the end of the demonstration and said, she was very apologetic. She said, "I hope you don't mind," she said. But she said it looked to her as though we were shaping the air around us. Which I think, far from minding, I told her I think it was one of the most lovely descriptions I've ever come across. So think of your arms as shaping something. Maybe like if you've ever worked with clay on a wheel to make a pot or something like that. Everything you need is there by the time it gets to the arms, apart from the shape of whatever movement we're doing. And just remind yourself every now and then, this feeling of movement, of momentum, of energy, however you label it, that you're getting in your arms at the moment. So if we now take this and raise our arms a little, then we hold our arms in position, just below shoulder height at most, elbows dropping down, fingers spread out, and arms are slightly in front of the body. I can't do it with both hands, I'll hit the wall. But you can see as I move, relative to my chest, the angle of my arm remains more or less the same. There'll be a little bit of opening up, but not a great deal. So I'm not doing this. I'm moving the whole of my upper body at once. And then just let your hands drop down. So hopefully it's fairly obvious in that case that in order to get that sense of energy to our arms and to get the flow of the movement and so on and so forth, we want to be able to move in the center of the body. And to move in the center of the body, we need to be able to drop our center of gravity. Because if we're holding our weight up here, that area will stiffen up. Imagine if I gave you a heavy box said hold it up above your head and then relax your shoulders. You think, well, I can't relax my shoulders, so I've got the box up here. But as soon as you put your hands down there, as soon as the weight goes below your shoulders, they'll start to relax. And it's the same thing, that if we can get our center of gravity to drop, we'll be more stable, for one thing, and we'll have a much better posture as a result, and a softer posture, because we won't be constantly feeling that we're falling over, and there'll just be less weight to carry in our hips and the whole of the upper body. So just seeing if you can find a place to let your weight settle somewhere between the middle and the ball of each foot, if that's comfortable. And your hips just dropping back a little bit, which would tend to allow the pelvis to tuck under. Soften your knees, a slight curve in your knees. So when I talk about sinking down and pushing up, this position here is the up position. We don't do this. You don't lock your knees back. And in general, you don't want to lock any of the joints. Joints are the spaces between bones. And this is true for all of the joints of the body. So that space is encapsulated, shall we say, by muscle, tendon, ligament, whatever, fascia. But the joint itself is really about the space to allow the movement. Think of your joints as being like the hinges of a door. You know, you wouldn't let somebody hang from your door with their full weight and swing to and fro, because you know you're going to damage the hinges and maybe the structure of the frame and so on and so forth. So joints like your knees shouldn't be weight bearing. We start to get a sense of our weight being transmitted through there. And then just let your hips drop back a little bit more and push up. And again, notice what you're doing, in particular with the knees. I'm talking about the knees. It could apply to ankles and hips, but more often to knees. That we just habitually tense our knees and then pushing up. Joints like the knees and hips are sometimes referred to as energy gates. They're the things that allow the passage of the energy, the movement through our body. And again, you don't habitually sit on your garden gate, put weight on it. But we do often have this habit of tightening our joints. And one of the contributory factors there is the condition of the muscles associated with the joint. All the major muscles, all the major joints will have particular muscles associated with them that support that joint. And in Tai Chi, we use the muscles that are associated with the knee to create the movement. So quadriceps in particular, the front of the thighs, but also hamstrings, calf muscles, and the rest. And the better condition those muscles are in, the less strain there will be on your knees. But when these muscles get tired, so when the big quadriceps get tired and they start to sort of jam up a little bit, as all muscles do when they get tired, you're probably going to end up putting more pressure on your knees. So two things. One is when that happens, give your legs a little bit of a shake, or even take a break, sit for a while if you need to let them recover. But the other thing is that over a period of time, these exercises will condition your legs, condition the muscles, and to a degree tendons and ligaments and so on. It's not just about the muscles. And that conditioning will mean that you'll be able to maintain these movements for longer without straining. And also, this is true for any exercise really, a muscle that's in better condition is not only going to last longer and be stronger, but will recover more quickly from exertion, because it improves the circulation. So over a period of time, we find that we're more and more likely to be comfortable in this position, to be able to maintain the postures and the movements for much longer. So with that in the back of your mind, notice that as your hips go up, this pushes up into your ribs, the ribs push into your shoulders. Because your shoulders are moving up and down, so are your hands and your fingers. So the energy is there. We now create the shape of cradling the ball. And as you push up and you feel that movement up through your upper body, the expansion pushes your elbows out a little bit. And then you drop down as though you're pushing the ball down into water. The elbows come a little bit in. So you're trying to keep your fingers together. Again, I'm going to come closer so you can see that perhaps a bit more clearly. I'll just do it on one side. If my elbows go out, it would tend to pull my fingers out, which isn't what we're doing. But if I keep my fingers in one place and the elbow goes out, my fingers would tend to rise. I'm not really thinking of lifting my arms. I'm thinking of my body expanding, my elbows being pushed out, and in a sense, just observing what my arms are doing. So rooting down, maintaining the shape of the movement, either with that image of the ball, or if the image doesn't help you, just think of this rounded quality. You see there at the top, there's a curve through my arm. And likewise, at the bottom, there's another curve there. What's true for our knees in terms of structure and how we use them is true for all of the big joints, elbows, shoulders, and so on. We really, the only time I would advocate completely straightening a joint would be if you're trying to stretch that particular part of the body and stretch particular muscles. And in that instance, you're not really thinking too much about movement, and you're not really thinking too much about what kind of load that joint needs to bear. So if I wanted to say, for instance, stretch the pectoral muscle, I might really lock back there to get the maximum stretch there. But I'm not going to try and sort of, I don't know, I'm not going to try and carry a shopping bag like this or something like that. Yeah. And it's a useful thing to do. I mean, I'm not saying that we shouldn't stretch, by the way. It is a useful thing. Now change to the wild goose. So again, the image of the bird in flight may be useful to you. But remember, we don't want to get distracted by these images. So there are some very lovely images out there, but they can be a tad distracting if we're not careful. We end up thinking about, watching geese on the coast in my case, or whatever. So the idea is with the images that we bring whatever qualities are useful to us from that image back into the movement. And then Heart in the Clouds. So here again, you see, as my arms go up, there's still that curve in my elbows. I'm not trying to do that. So why I sometimes say that what we get with some of these movements is what I would describe as a soft stretch, not a full stretch. And then dragon plucks the stars from the sky. So one of the characteristics that I like to think of when I'm doing these movements, one that is general for all of the movements, comes out of the basic posture, is that there's a sense of spaciousness, not just in the joints, but through the whole body. And we're looking to move in a way that means that we could have moved a little bit further to 80% of the full movement. And that maintains this sense of the inner environment, the inner landscape of our bodies, having space for movement. So if you go to a full stretch, it's a bit like wearing a shirt that's a half a size too tight. You can move, but there's always a sense of restriction there. And the idea with Tai Chi, Qigong, is not to have that restriction. One more time on each side. Now, pushing in 4 directions. The first movement, your hands are here just a little bit above your head and slightly in front of your body. Playing around with that a little bit until you feel that the weight of your arm can be transmitted down through your sides. And then smoothly returning, rest beside your hips. The next 3 movements all use this sideways movement. And again, you can see my hands aren't up here and they're not back here, slightly in front. And the second movement, we add a little bit of a turn. And we come back. And then pushing out again, turn a little bit again, the turn is in your hips. And then back. And then pushing out to the sides. Notice how my elbows hang down. And back. So pushing in 4 directions. And the final point and the starting point for each of those directions is a comfortable one. We can bring our hands to a position where we are able to, if necessary, and we don't normally do this, it's a common thing in Tai Chi, but once you get moving, you don't generally hold the postures, but it's comfortable there. You're not straining for this position, nor are you straining for the starting position. And that means that the transition in between is far more likely to be smooth. And so we get that sense of something happening within the body, movement, patterns of movement, a flow of energy, momentum as we feel, our hips connecting with our ribs again, and so on and so forth, as we did in the first exercise. But one way or another, we want that movement, whatever label we put on it, we want that movement to be smooth, as fluid as possible, as unrestricted as possible, as harmonious as possible. Sometimes described as though you're being massaged from the inside. This is quite tricky with some of the exercises, of course, so it's quite challenging. So it's good to try and establish these ideas and the principles of posture and movement that help to bring them into some kind of reality in the simpler exercises. Those areas in your body, if they exist, which they probably do, that feel a bit tight or stiff or blocked, you may find are gently eased by that movement in the same way that if you've got stiff shoulders and a friend massages your shoulders, they can loosen up. Sometimes we might want to be a little bit more assertive with that idea and just sort of target, oh, my back's tight. Can I change something? Can I actively take my attention into that area and look for that feeling of releasing, of opening that becomes familiar to us, particularly in the returning movements. It's easier to get that feeling of releasing as your arms come back towards the center of your body. Sometimes I suggest an image of water flowing over a rock in a riverbed, gradually smoothing it off. So again, we have a variety of approaches, of ways that we can begin to just work creatively with these areas that do feel a little bit blocked. One more round of this. Just check your posture. Is your weight still a little bit forwards? Are your hips dropping back? Or have you, without even realizing it, stiffened up in your knees? It's a very common habit. Maybe your hips or ankles or all three. Maybe your shoulders have tightened up. So when we get back to here each time, maybe if you think about it, just a little sort of posture check. And again, that's a habit that we get into. And then with your left hand, swinging out. And again, as your arm comes down, maybe that feeling of a kind of tightness, straining away. As your hand comes to the side, just a split second, yeah, my posture's fine, or no, I need to adjust, or whatever. So one of the attributes that is connected with this idea of the punctuation points, those moments in between stages of each movement here and at the bottom here, for instance, where the movement seems to just sort of like drain away almost. This time, in that moment, you add the turn if it's comfortable for you. So I used to refer to these moments as pauses. I now think of them more as punctuation points, like a comma in a sentence, because it's not a pause. It's not an absence of movement. Changing sides. So an awareness of those points and a willingness just to introduce the comma, to introduce the idea of the punctuation. We can see how it benefits our movement and our posture, because each time we do that, we're checking in. And so we begin to notice any little changes, you know, foot slipped out, or again, the hips have tightened up, or something like that. There are also the points quite often where we can get confused in the movement. So they introduce a little bit of clarity there. Here, in that point, you can add the turn if it's comfortable. And they also introduce this idea of a stillness within the movement, a reluctance to get rushed in our minds. And so that calm quality of both mind and body very much enhanced through this willingness, in a sense, this intent to consider those punctuation points. Now, go back to this movement. So the next two movements, there's a change from the vertical to, well, I won't say horizontal, but certainly angling out. And once again, the key area here is going to be the pelvis, the center of your body, that area between pelvis and waist, really. When we do this, give or take a few movements, your pelvis is remaining level. If it didn't, then either you would tighten up in your back and lose your posture, or your shoulders would go forwards. And it's that latter that we're trying to introduce. We've done the horizontal rotation in the center of the body. Now's the time for the vertical rotation. So the next time you sink down, push your hips back and notice what your shoulders do. Before you come up again, before you sort of push up from the ground, let your hips just sink back and feel your pelvis tucking under. Notice how that affects your shoulders, and then push up. So we rotate horizontally and then vertically, and then vertically again and push up. And this is the basis for the movement, rowing a boat in the middle of the lake, and for polishing the table that comes shortly after. So first of all, rowing a boat. So notice that I've carefully avoided mentioning our arms. Our arms respond to the movement of our hips, well, they respond to the movement of our shoulders, which in their turn respond to the movement of the hips. And again, I used to say to people that the hips going back counterbalances the angling forwards. I now say the opposite to people, that your hips go back, and to counterbalance that, your hands, your shoulders, your head go forwards, the hips go down, and to counterbalance that, the head comes up. So we reframe the idea of coming upright and pulling ourselves upright with a sense that, well, we can just allow ourselves to come up. And that has a very marked effect on chest and upper back in particular, almost as though your head were floating up rather than having to be sort of pushed up or held up. And then bringing your hands in front of your hips, polishing the table. We turn horizontally first of all, and then push the hips back, turn horizontally again, and let the hips drop down. So essentially, our hips are moving in a circle. I exaggerate, my knees will go out of line when I do this, but I turn, I push my hips back, I swing across, I come back up, almost like a dog wagging its tail. And again, my arms mirror that circular movement in my hips and lower back. Once again, we see the significance of the center part of the body and the area from there down into our feet, legs. Do one more in each direction. So last time, polishing the table. Good. And then just let your hands drop. Shake hands. So the phrase is sometimes used that in Tai Chi, we go to 80% of the full movement. I've explained before, but I'll say again, I'm never entirely comfortable with that, especially since I do teach sometimes people who do have very little movement, and to say almost don't bother moving would be wrong. A friend of mine who's a physiotherapist came up with this model, which I think is really helpful, that we have two boundaries to our movements. we have what we refer to as a hard boundary. So I push that arm out there as much as possible. My shoulder, elbow, wrist and fingers are all locked. Everything's really tight. Everything's locked up. And that's my hard boundary. My side is getting stiff and so on. If I go to there, this is the soft boundary. So it's the soft boundary that we work to, and it's the soft boundary that we aim to extend out. We would never think about doing that, but what we might want to do is over a period of time feel that our overall range of movement is increasing, and so that 80% is gradually getting better, almost like a river. With the water flowing through the riverbank and the water just slowly eroding and dissolving away the sides of the riverbank so that it gets wider, rather than pushing hard for to stretch and so on and so forth. So your range of movement will gradually increase through the use of the movement itself. Changing the posture. Let's go to the forward posture, what we refer to as the bow stance. So here, our back foot is turned out. An angle maybe 30, 40 degrees. You can play around with that. Keeping the width of your step, you step forwards. So I'm not going to here. If you imagine that as I stand here, I've got parallel lines running through my feet, tram lines we sometimes refer to them as. Then here, I'm stepping along those tram lines and about the same length as width, or maybe a little bit longer. With my weight on the back foot, I can get about 70% of the weight in. The hip is open. And in fact, I was talking about what happens when we stand on two legs. On one leg, we do have a certain amount of leeway. And if you find that you're angled slightly, don't concern yourself with that too much to begin with. It's a correction that we make over a period of time. When I go forward, because this hip isn't turned out, this foot isn't turned out, and the hip isn't open, I can only really get about 60% of my weight comfortably in that leg. You'll notice that when I get to the stepping part of it, I always turn this front foot out a little bit just to get a little bit more weight there. And again, I can sit on that front leg and I can have a range of movement horizontally, but to begin with, make sure it's pointing straight ahead. So once again, hips, shoulders, front foot at least, all facing the same direction. And just beginning to transfer your weight. 70% in the back, forward to 60% in front. Once again, if you look at my front knee as I go back, the angle of the knee gets straighter, but it doesn't lock out. And as I go forwards, the knee will get straighter, but not this. You see, well, I see very clearly with the back foot when I stiffen up in the knee. Not only is it locking the knee, which is not good for the knee, but it's projecting me forwards a little bit. It's throwing my entire posture out. This is a really good exercise for conditioning your legs in the way that I was describing earlier, and for really helping with mobility issues in legs. When I started doing Tai Chi, I was having trouble with my knees because I'd done a bit of long distance cycling and managed to strain the tendons of my knees. I found almost straight away this exercise really, really helpful. And the weight transfer is a key, sometimes overlooked element in general mobility as well. Be able to accurately drop your weight into one leg or another can be really helpful just in your everyday movements. Now when I go back, I raise my front toes, and that means I get slightly more than 70% of my weight in the front foot. This is where I turn the front foot out, I go forward, my back knee pushes forwards again, slightly more than that 60%. But gradually, more of my weight accumulating, draining down through each leg. With the overall intent here that what we want to get to is a point where the only weight remaining in what we would refer to as the empty leg, the lighter leg, would be the weight of the leg itself. And it's at that point that we contract the leg and draw the foot in and push out. Make sure you place the foot, plant the foot back in the correct position. And shake out. It's not an exercise in standing on one leg. I know I was standing on one leg, but that's not really the aim of the exercise. Sometimes you'll see me do this. Let's put the toes down. That's fine. We're not trying to balance. When I'm on one leg like this, for instance, like this, if I was standing like this, what I'm looking for is to reproduce this posture. You know, I've talked about the alignment of the pelvis, how the pelvis affects the shoulders. We know from rowing the boat and polishing the table that when our hips move backwards, then our shoulders move forward. So if I'm standing here and, for instance, one hip drops down, my body turns over that way, and so on and so forth. So we know that the center of the body and its alignment with the ground is very important. So I'm looking for that. I'm looking to drop my center of gravity again, lower your center of gravity, the better. So I would always maintain that I'm not actually balancing, I'm stable. It's only if I become a little bit unstable, now I need to balance. This is why my arms have gone out. But if I can, then I'll come back to that stable position and no longer need to balance. I know this sounds like playing with words, but if we reframe the problem of standing on one leg is a problem, then we can take a different approach to it. What I would recommend, if it's something that is important to you, is you stand next to a wall and play around with this. Obviously, you don't want to fall over. So, well, what happens here? You've got the wall to help you. What happens here? How can I go from here to here? And effectively, it's encapsulated in this idea of releasing, softening, relaxing, if you like. And it's a little bit counterintuitive to start off with. So that's why I say hold on to the wall or something like that. Feel how it's working in your own body. And then if you're ever unfortunate enough to sort of trip on the pavement or something like that, one day, hopefully you'll do what a lot of people have fed back to me they do in situations like that, which is you simply drop down. You don't need to balance at that point. You drop your center of gravity. So try that with your other foot forwards. It's not just about whether we fall. That's the extreme end of our body going out of line. And when our body goes out of line, when we lose those connections in the body, we're more likely to strain, create tension, and so on and so forth. And there's all sorts of reasons why that may happen. So we must take these things very gently. So transferring your weight 70% into the back foot. Effectively, you're being pushed forwards and backwards. Again, like riding the bike moves, you stay aligned on the frame of the bike, on the saddle. And everything's fine. Lean out too far, and that can happen. Beginning to raise your toes and your heel. Notice what happens when you put your heel down. Can you feel your foot sort of connecting again to the ground? Same thing with the toes. You roll the foot down and press the foot into the ground a little bit. Just be sure of that connection downwards. Another one of those little punctuation points, I think. And then stepping in. My foot goes forwards and out. I'll maintain that width of step. And just letting my legs swing my hip in much the same way as earlier. Our arms were swinging from our shoulders. So it's a shorter than normal step. So I don't want to do this. See, that's now throwing me out. Everything goes wrong at that point. Imagine your pelvis as being like a bowl of water. And as you move, you don't want it to tilt, you just spill the water. And then just stepping through whichever direction you have the space. So again, quite challenging to maintain this basic posture while we're walking, but just remind yourself, we're not going for power or speed. We're not going for lunging steps. And then go in the other direction. Don't concern yourself. I mean, if you have the odd wobble, it doesn't mean you're failing. It's a difficult and very rewarding exercise, this one. And shake out. And again, this is an exercise which, if you do feel a bit wobbly, just next to the wall, your hand just lightly touching the wall, so that can help you to orientate yourself. So it's a useful exercise, that one, and I think quite a challenging exercise. Now have your right foot forwards. Fisherman castanet. Start with your weight in your back foot, push forwards, and as you settle into your front foot, let your arms swing through. Same idea going back. Remember that feeling from the very first, the opening exercise of your arms swinging from your shoulders. The same kind of idea now. It has the same feeling, but obviously going slowly, it's a little bit more difficult to really, you haven't really got the momentum that the speed of the movement in the first instance gives you. So a bit more subtle, a little bit more attention. You're facing straight ahead, as I said. This time, as you go back, turn. Notice how that draws your hands across the body. And this time, let your hands curve up so they're just below shoulder height. And as they start to come down, move your weight forwards, turn towards the front, turn out a little bit, swing your arms across, and they come up and down. Tracing this figure of 8 movement. And as much as possible, the palms of your hands facing the direction of the movement. So here they're facing up, they rotate round about here and they're facing downwards. And as you turn here, they go up again and then down. Good, and shake out. Back to the parallel stance. Step forward with your left foot, and then again, fisherman cast the net. When I say we're looking ahead, remember a slight angle isn't a problem, and better to be slightly out in the upper part of the body and to feel that you're twisting your knees up or whatever. So it's not, ideally we are looking straight ahead, but once again, we don't want to put that sort of strain on the body. Good, and then turn in. When your arms come up, don't overextend them, don't pull your shoulders out of line. So again, your arms following the movement of the rest of the body, following the shape in your mind. Now, turn your front foot out, come forwards. As you turn and raise your arms, raise your back heel, or across a little bit, and bring your foot in. Now just rest here for a moment. You can have the foot up in the air if you're feeling brave. I'm going to keep mine down. Notice where my arms are. Now watch what happens when I push my arms away from the body. I disappear. So there's a limit to how far our arms can go out without either causing us to stiffen up or pulling us over. So we have to think about this and how far that range of movement is appropriate again. Turn your hands, step forwards, and then once again, bring the back foot in, bring your arms into position. Again, give yourself a few moments just to work out. You want as much as possible, but here I can feel across my back I'm tightening up. I either want to think, or can I sink my hips a bit more, release that tightening, or just draw my arms back a little bit. I step. Same thing on this side, just check in for a moment. And again. Same thing in the other direction, being careful about planting the foot. Good, and then same thing, but a little bit more flowing, but not rushed. And when you run out of space, just change in direction. Okay, shake out. Now, rubbing your hands together. Tapping over your face. Over your head and neck. Down to one shoulder and your arm. And the other side. And your back. Around your hips. And then legs. Light on your belly. And the other part of your chest. So right from the start of this class, I've really emphasized this posture and its characteristics. So the last movement of the class, we will make a point of coming back to that, return into the mountain and just sink down, push up, and just having a sense of what it is that brings you back, you know, feeling the gravity working through your body, or the image of the mountain, or all of different things at different times. But just get that sense. This is, you know, when you're standing on one leg and you're feeling a little bit wobbly, or you trip on the pavement, this is what you want to be feeling, however you would label it. One more time. And stand. Shake out. Lovely. Thank you very much.